Uh, good afternoon, everyone. Let me welcome respected Secretary Health, Dr. Valeria Directors, Lee Sonny, and most important to our Center of Excellence and other partners who want to video conference. Sir, with your permission, we just run through a few slides just to put the issue in perspective, sir, and then with your guidance further to that, sir. Sir, today the topic for discussion is COVID case management, primarily focused on management of complications for COVID-19 and use of inflammatory markers, sir. Sir, in this, the point good. So the point to highlight here is that the point to highlight here is 6 states are accounting for more than 80% of total deaths reported so far in the country. There are Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Delhi, Karnataka, Gujarat, and UP, which are constituting as high as 41%, 11%, 10%, 7%, 6%, 5% the deaths reported in the country. So one side, while absolute number of deaths is critical, second parallel issue, there are states which are reporting high CFR than the national average, and I would just like to highlight particularly Gujarat, Maharashtra, Delhi, Madhya Pradesh, Punjab, West Bengal, where when we have in India case fatality rate of 2.1%, these states are reporting as high as 3.9, 3.5%, etc. We have done an analysis, sir, in terms of how the comorbidity in age group is affecting the overall case fatality, and we have taken into consideration the data fed into the ICMR portal when the samples are collected. Based on that, this analysis is done, and where we located that either it is cardiovascular disease, diabetes, hypertension, respiratory disease, ILI, high BP, or patients who are immunocompromised. Once we analyze that data, we realize that as for the 45 to 59 age are concerned, the death in this particular age group, if it is non-comorbid patient, 1.62% deaths are reported. When it comes to comorbid patient, it is actually approximately 10 times high, that is 11.72%. Similarly, if you go into the higher age bracket, with respect to 60 to 74, for the non-comorbid, if it is 4.17% fatality, it is as high as 21% in comorbid condition. And if it is 75 and above, 7.25% non-comorbid case fatality is as high as 30%. The point to highlight here is that how we identify work with these comorbid patients so that in effect we can end up reducing our overall case fatality is something which we need to discuss today, sir. And we have just analyzed also, sir, when it comes to high CFR state and all the CEOs are present in this particular discussion today, Gujarat, Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh, West Bengal, Delhi, and Punjab. So we have analyzed their data vis-a-vis the rest of the India. And this is a cause of concern. I would like really request the CEOs which are present here today to kindly take note of that. That when it comes to 45 to 59 age group, for the low CFR, that is except for these 6 states, if the comorbid patient fatality is 5.7%, it is 14.6% when it comes to these 6 states. Similarly, for the 60 to 74 age group, if low CFR, that is rest of India, it is 11.1% for the comorbid cases, it is 25% when it comes to these 6 states. And above 65, if it is 17% for the rest of the country, 35.9% as far as these 6 states are concerned. So the cause of concern here, I would just like to submit is that we need to focus on these states. What is the reason when other parts of the country, the death is much lower within this age bracket as well as people having comorbidity? Why and what are the reasons? What corrective action needs to be done as far as these states are concerned? So just to highlight further, there are all the SARI and ILI cases for which samples have been tested. We have analyzed the data given into the ICMR portal, and we realized that there are 7 states where SARI confirmation percentage is voted higher than the national average, which is 21%. So just to highlight, even 21% is high, but there are states which are reporting higher, which means wider spread of infection, and then the adequate focus given on early identification and containment method is the point I would like to highlight. 15 districts. We just cited these 15 districts just to highlight that in the SARI cases, which are the samples which are collected, the percentage of SARI confirmation has varied from 44% to 57%, which again is a major cause of concern, and that is why
what you are saying is that this is the percentage of positivity in SARI.
exactly, sir, for the samples collected.
Someone should be looking deeper into this.
Exactly.
They're not testing enough SARI.
Yes, sir. Similarly, 11 states, when we see the INI cases also, there are 11 states which are having confirmation percentage which is higher than national average, which is 17%. I mean, these states again, Jammu, Kashmir, Ladakh, Bihar, Gujarat, Dadra, Nagar Haveli, Maharashtra, Karnataka, Telangana, Tamil Nadu, and Puducherry. And when it comes to, if we even analyze with respect to the district from where these samples are collected, it is varying from 45% to 77%. So I would, as the Secretary Sir has mentioned, that it's important that we start focusing on these particular issues also. So we did an analysis with respect to what has been the cause or what have been the issues which have been highlighted by few of the facilities which are reporting higher case fatality, just to sort of take their understanding in the guidance. So just to give you ideas, at Gujarat facility which at 12% CFR, when we discussed with them, they highlighted limited use of inflammatory marker only when advised by clinician. No specific protocol around use of D dimer, serum ferritin for screening comorbid patients at the time of admission. Similarly, in a facility in Maharashtra which reported 30% CFR, there they talked about early identification of complications which could reduce cases of microcapillary thrombosis, hyperglycemia, intrapulmonary vascular coagulation in our facility. And Gujarat facility which had reported 18% CFR, clinical treatment guidance is required for various complications. Patient condition deteriorates rapidly, and there is limited knowledge on ground for administration of endothermic control care, including septic shock, CRRT, oxygen therapy, anti-thrombotic and vascular endotherapy. Further, sir, we had actually been following up with all the COE. We have been requesting them to give their input on what issues they would like to discuss or take guidance from our National Center of Excellence. And we have just listed out those issues related to complications, drug administration, sir. I mean, it is already there, but just to cite, they talked about management of ARDS, predictors of progression to complication in a previously healthy individual, then how to manage patients with subcutaneous emphysema or positive pressure ventilation, then management of patients with altered sensorium, what should be the guidance for cardiovascular complications, what is our guidance on management of cytokine storm, similarly mortality in CKD and malignant patients, guidance on lung fibrosis, when should ECMO be triggered. So the point I would just like to submit here that this is a very exhaustive list. Already AIMS colleagues are aware of this list, and I'm just trying to only communicate is that considering what issues have been reflected here, it shows. Can you continue that? The last slide. It shows that still a consultative process is needed in terms of understanding at the field level so that we can save pressure line. All the private administration issue are just like to cite the issues raised in Jharkhand and Rajasthan with respect to is there any threat for IRC to start with my similarly status of total tumor after phase 3 of Roche data, guidance on use of heparin, use of Ayurvedic supplements without increasing side effects. Similarly, sir, can we use very known in patient required treatment? This is the type of issue which has come up. And sir, I'll just stop here. I mean, the idea here is that we reflect that these are the type of issues which are coming from field, and then our colleagues from the guidance for us. If I can kindly request your message on the issue.
Thank you, Love, and a very good evening to all of you. What we are trying to do through this series of interactions is to ensure that whatever doubts or clarifications that the State Center of Excellence desire are addressed by the AIMS New Delhi team of subject specialists. It is important to realize that in the last 6 months, we at the Ministry of Health and the state governments, as well as the various medical college hospitals, including the centers of excellence in states and UTs, have broadly understood the virus and how it behaves. What needs to be fine tuned are clinical treatment and the various complications that arise in course of the clinical treatment. So today, when Love was setting the context, he did point out to the fact that in high fertility states, that is states and UTs, where we are seeing a higher rate of mortality, what are the major issues that are being raised either by the various participating medical college hospitals or by the state's center of excellence? What I need to tell you before we open up the discussion is that as public health managers or as people who are looking at the broader picture of how the infection has spread and infection is being treated, we should not only look at the overall historical data in terms of fertility, we should be monitoring this fertility on a day-to-day basis and also on a weekly average basis. So we know where the actual trend is going. At times, when we look at the historical data of fertility, we do tend to lose focus because there are certain states where in the initial phases the fertility was more because of multiple reasons, but of late it has plateaued or it is actually declining. So while we look at the historical data, we still get an alarmist picture, whereas the picture as it exists in our health facilities may be different from the absolute number. So that is something that people who are in the health departments in the states, as well as people who are in the state centers of excellence, need to focus. Please focus on facility-wise mortality. Please focus on daily mortality. Please also focus on average weekly mortality, and then look at the specific complications that these facilities are finding difficult to tackle. So at the present moment in time, that is all I wanted to tell you. We could now proceed further. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. And I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome all the centers of excellence that have come on board today for this webinar. This is in continuation of all the activities that we've been doing at AIMS New Delhi. Yesterday, we had our clinical grand round where we discussed a case, and some of the questions that you had raised or that I've seen here were discussed yesterday also. And every Tuesday and Friday, we also have our EICU meetings with various COVID hospitals where we have a one-to-one interaction with the treating physicians there. But I think this clinical excellence program and with the centers of excellence is very important because this will help the various state centers of excellence to really disseminate the information and look at the regional issues and how they can address them in terms of managing COVID-19. We've realized over the last few weeks that one is that the strategy of management is varied from state to state depending upon the knowledge and the infrastructure available there. And it is also varied from what we have learned as far as the virus is concerned. When COVID-19 started early this year, it was thought it would be just a viral pneumonia, starting with upper respiratory tract infection and going down into the lower respiratory tract, causing a viral pneumonia. And we initially treated it predominantly as a viral pneumonia. Now we realize that it has a lot of other complications, which we call the extrapulmonary manifestation of COVID-19, which can vary from cardiac, neurological, dermatological, kidney involvement, gastrointestinal involvement. And therefore, we realize that this is more and more of a systemic disease with significant complications happening in different organs. And therefore, our treatment strategy has also evolved from what we were doing in the beginning to what we are doing now. From the drugs that we were giving drugs like lopinavir, retinovir early, which we are no longer giving. We were not giving anticoagulants, but we now realize that it causes a hypercoagulable state, and we are starting anticoagulants early in the course of disease. We realize the importance of oxygen therapy and the fact that we are now giving aggressive oxygen conscious proning, which is also something which has evolved over the last few months. The role of steroids in moderate to severe disease has also become important. I think it's also important for all of us to understand that although we have a number of treatment strategies, the place of each treatment in the overall evolution of the disease is very important. If you start something too early, it can be harmful. If you wait too long, it may not be that effective. So it's important that we know that as the disease moves from one phase to the other, what is the ideal treatment in that phase so that we can save lives and we can bring down the mortality. Also, how do we monitor individuals for the extra pulmonary complications that they may have? It could be myocarditis, cardiac failure, it could be a stroke, it could be presentation with GI disturbances, or it could be presentation with a hypercoagulable state which is causing thrombotic complication. So it's important for us not only to be able to recognize and treat these complications, but also have a strategy from the beginning to be able to treat so that these complications don't occur, and we should be able to prevent them. And I think we are learning a lot as the pandemic is progressing and knowledge about the virus and its complications is increasing. So treatment strategy that we have today is different from the treatment strategy that we had a month ago, and it is different from what we had, I would say, 3 or 4 months ago. And that is why having these webinars, I think, is very, very important. And I would actually want that after we have the discussion of the topic, we have a good interaction with all the people who are managing patients so that we realize the issues that they're facing and how we can help them address these issues. This is a learning for both of us. We would also learn from the experience that you have had, and we will try and share our experience so that you can also have better practices in your hospitals and your centers, and thereby we can decrease the mortality not only in one area but at a national level. So I think that is the message that I would like to give, and we can move to the next stage of the webinar. I can ask Dr. Manish Suneja to really make his presentation on the management of complications of COVID-19. And after that, we can take up some of the questions that have been addressed, and we can also have a question answer session from the various centers of excellence which have come on board. So I'll ask Manish to start with his presentation.
Thank you, sir. So I'll be briefly discussing about the role of inflammatory markers in management of COVID-19 complications. So as we all know, we basically have three stages of the disease, the natural history of COVID-19. The vast majority of patients, nearly more than 80%, have a mild infection wherein the virus is localized to the upper respiratory tract, and the patient recovers without much of a treatment requirement. But 20% of these patients progresses further. They have viral pneumonitis, which may be localized, which may be extensive, and these patients require oxygen. 5% of them further go on to develop a condition called a cytokine storm, wherein the localized inflammation of the lung spills over into the systemic compartment, and we have a generalized state of hyperinflammation, the cytokine storm. So these are the rough figures: 80%, 15%, and 5%. Now, the most pertinent question that comes to the mind of a treating physician is when a patient comes in the first week of illness, and the most pertinent question that comes to mind is, how will my patient progress over the disease course? So what are the predictors of severe disease? A myriad of complications we know as of now. So short term and long term. In short term, we have respiratory failure, ARDS. There are cardiovascular complications. We have acute liver injury. Then, of course, cytokine release syndrome. There are many neurological manifestations. And in the long term, we have pulmonary fibrosis and something now we are calling as post-COVID syndrome. So let's see, when do we need prognostic predictors? So basically, we need the prognostic predictors at 2 time points. In case of mild patients, we need to remember that most of these patients are being managed at home or at COVID care centers. So not much of diagnostic support is available at this point. So at this point 1, what we need is more of a clinical predictors of severity, whether this mild patients will progress to moderate, and accordingly they need to be managed or triaged. Second point is the one when patients are admitted in hospital, they are having oxygen requirement. The question is whether they will progress on and would have increasing respiratory support requirement, would they require invasive ventilation or organ failure, etc. So at this time in point, at this point 2, we need to have a lab support, a support of certain biomarkers. So let's come to the clinical predictors of disease severity that is to be employed in mild patients. So these are 2 demographic wise: old age, older age, and male gender. The older age, now various studies have given different cutoffs. Some study talk about 55 years, at others it is 60, somewhere it's 65. But an important point to remember is to look at a holistic picture. Now, if we take a cutoff, let's say 60 years, we cannot treat the patient with 59 years as low risk and 61 years as high risk. So this is a problem when we are doing a dichotomization of a continuous variable. So whole picture needs to be taken into account. Usually the cutoff age that is kept is 60 years. Above 60 years is the risk for disease severity. Male gender is also a risk factors for severe disease. Then there are comorbidities, the well-known ones: cardiovascular disease, including hypertension, diabetes. Then there's chronic kidney and liver disease, immunosuppression, malignancy. Now it is seen that fatality rates are uh, quite high in all these comorbidities compared to a person without comorbidity, when the wherein the mortality rate is pretty less than 1%. So these patients needs to be identified, they need to be triaged, it needs to be ensured even if these patients are on home isolation, if they have risk factors for severe disease, there should be mechanism available to bring them to a healthcare facility at a short notice. Then radiographic predictors are there. So chest X-ray will help in detecting disease progression, that is disease progression from stage 1 to 2, when the virus moves in from the upper respiratory tract and causes viral pneumonitis. CT obviously will be more sensitive, and now in fact there are scores that has been developed for CT and chest X-ray to predict disease severity in COVID. Once a patient is admitted, we have more options to investigate. So there are actually more than 30 biomarkers which have been studied and have been said to be predictor, but we need to focus on the practical ones, the ones which we may have access to. Even access to 2 or 3 of these may be sufficient. So these are D-dimer, C-reactive protein, serum ferritin, LDH, and interleukin 6. So coming to D-dimer, D-dimer is basically a marker of coagulopathy that is going on due to COVID-related coagulopathy. This pulmonary vascular coagulopathy in particular, it's a representation of the underlying hypercoagulability. And there are multiple studies which have shown D-dimer to be a very good predictor, which can be used for triage. Also, a level has been given, a level of more than 1 microgram per ml, and also shown to be a predictor of mortality across various studies. So if we look at these few of studies, so there are levels given in non-severe patients in the second column. Third column shows the level in severe patients. The point to note here is, in non-severe patients, the level is mostly around 0.5 to 0.6, which is the normal cutoff. And in severe patients, it is more than 2 microgram per ml. And this is very consistent across various studies. So D-dimer seems to be a very promising predictor, which can be used, and particularly at baseline at admission in moderate patients. Coming to C-reactive protein, this is a non-specific acute phase reactant and has been shown to be associated disease severity because of its short half-life. It rises early in the disease course. These are the advantages. and studies have looked at the levels that are achieved that are there in non-severe patients and severe patients. As we can see, even in non-severe patients, that is mild COVID patients, there is some degree of elevation of CRP, something which we didn't see in D-dimer. In D-dimer, in mild patients, it was normal, but here CRP levels are elevated, and in this study, the first study, Lee et al., it is elevated to nearly 5 times the upper limit of normal, and in severe patients, it goes up to 10 times the upper limit of normal. So a level of cutoff is difficult to predict because it is variable across various studies. This is about ferritin as a predictor of disease severity, a very busy slide. We just need to highlight here. So on the left is the average ferritin levels in the mild patients, and on the right is the ferritin levels in severe patients. And we can observe all the values, nearly all the values in mild patients are less than 500 nanogram per liter, and the average value in severe patients is more than 800. So again, we are getting a good differentiation, good cutoff value for ferritin to be used as a predictor of disease severity. Interleukin 6 has generated a lot of interest recently as a predictor of cytokine storm in COVID-19. Obviously, this is seen higher in severe disease compared to non-severe disease. It rises very sharply in severe manifestations of COVID-19. Again, the half-life is 11-12 hours, so it can actually be repeated daily to monitor a patient if required. And there's a lot of debate about the level to decide anti-IL-6 therapy in cytokine storm if indicated. We'll come to that. So again, if you see the few studies where the IL-6 levels have been compared between non-severe and severe patients, the p-values look very attractive, all are highly significant. But if we look closely, look at these, the range that is given. So it is 0 to 11.2, it is 1.8 to 37, and it is same for all the three. The meaning is when we are talking about a group of patients, yes, statistically there is comparison. Yes, the p-values are very significant. But when we are dealing with a single patient, due to these overlapping values that we see in these studies, a single value may not be very helpful in predicting severe disease. Then there is LDH. It has again shown to be a predictive biomarker for severe disease. In fact, one study has said that a level more than 365 can predict mortality with more than 90% accuracy. Of course, this is just a single study. We can't go by a single study. And again, levels compared across different studies are showing a lot of overlap. So one has to be careful while using LDH as a prognostic marker of disease severity. Just a word on procalcitonin because it's not mentioned there, but procalcitonin has again, this is a forest plot comparing procalcitonin in mild versus severe disease in absence of any proven bacterial infection. We see that even in severe disease without any bacterial infection, the procalcitonin levels are higher. The odds ratio is 4.7, and this basically is the result of disease severity, the systemic inflammation causing rise in procalcitonin. So this also brings in the problem how to diagnose a bacterial infection if we are suspecting a bacterial infection, superinfection in a patient of COVID-19. To sum up, these are the thresholds that we can use. D-dimer 1 microgram is something which is uniformly given across studies. C-reactive protein, there is variable cutoffs that are being given. Serum ferritin maybe 500, LDH 250. Again, there is doubt about interleukin. Interleukin, one thing is very important, that various methods are being employed to measure interleukin. So at our place, we have a point of care machine which gives it the range as 5 to 15 picogram per ml. But other places I have seen they are using 300 picogram per ml as the cutoff of normal. So one has to be very sure which method is being used and what is the upper limit of cutoff. Just to touch upon, talked about inflammatory markers. So this is also much used, simple, available, can be done daily. These are immune parameters, WBC count of more than 10,000, odds ratio of nearly 3 as a predictor of severe disease, lymphocyte count less than 1,000, odds ratio is nearly 5 times as to predict a severe disease. And again, neutrophil lymphocyte ratio is also very attractive predictor of severe disease. So these are something which are very easily available and can be done on a daily routine basis. To sum it up, just giving you a clinical picture. So this is a patient admitted last month with us, a 60-year-old male. known case of hypertension, well controlled. He presented with fever and cough of 1 week duration and 1 day shortness of breath. He came to the casualty. He had hypoxemia. The oxygen was instituted. Standard therapy with steroids and low molecular weight heparin was initiated. He was in the ward for a few days. Oxygen requirement varied between 2 to 4 liters. Whenever it tends to cross 4 liters, we advise awake proning. So this patient was compliant with awake proning also. But as a protocol, we did this inflammatory markers on the right side panel. If you can see, TLC is more than 10,000, lymphocyte is less than 1,000. Only the D dimer level is normal in this patient. See the IL-6 levels. It's nearly 9 times the upper limit of normal. And ferritin is pretty high, more than 1100. The chest X-ray is classic of COVID. But we felt that our patient is stable. He clinically remained stable, the oxygen requirement gradually decreased, and he recovered uneventfully. Though, if we just look at the biomarkers, we may conclude that he's in cytokine storm and we need to give some sort of a very aggressive therapy like anti-IL-6 therapy. But this gives the message that clinical picture is the most essential thing in your patient. Biomarkers can only supplement the clinical picture. It should not be the only deciding factor. So the take home message is always use a combination of inflammatory markers. None of the inflammatory markers alone might be sufficient to give a clue as a predictor of severe disease. D-dimer appears to be the most promising though. So if available, a D-dimer, CRP and serum ferritin at baseline in moderate patients may be done. And a trend is more important than a single value because of those overlapping issues. And always use inflammatory markers in light of clinical picture because the clinical picture is the most essential pointer to the condition of the patient. Thank you.
Thank you, Manish, for this presentation, which was the topic for the day. So we'll take some questions which we've got from the different states. The first question is, if I can, on the panel we have, let me introduce that Professor Tinka, who's a professor in anesthesia and head of our COVID center, which has been established in the trauma center. Professor Anant Mohan, who is the head of pulmonary medicine, and Manish, his additional professor in medicine, who's just presented his this case, this on biomarkers, who made a presentation just now. So the first question, if I can ask Dr. Tanka, which comes from Kerala, is on management of ARDS weaning. So I think they want to know how would you gradually take off the patient of ARDS.
Okay, see, we have all seen that once the patient goes on a ventilator, he is in ARDS, the outcome really deteriorates, and weaning is an issue which with a large number of these patients. Weaning these patients of COVID ARDS is likely to be the same as in a normal ARDS patient. However, one must realize that these patients are, if they are likely to be re-intubated or they are having failure of weaning processes or a spontaneous breathing trial, they will be generating more aerosols and the possibility of infection would increase. So one must be very clear, very sure what are your protocols once you are weaning off and extubating these patients of post COVID-19 ARDS. We at our place would follow the same things, have a spontaneous breathing trial done once the FiO2 is about 0.4, fully conscious, a tachycardia which is less than 110 or 100, not on a major amount of inotropic sport, and the other parameters are fine. We'll try to wean off these patients, and everybody should follow the same protocols. Once we are trying to wean off, giving them trials, we must realize that if you do a cuff deflation test, it will again give rise to aerosols. So the protection of the healthcare workers with the PP is on, and it should not be. There should be no prevention of, or there should be no let away in having these kind of patients when they are fine, as compared to other patients where aerosol generation is not an issue. Lastly, at many hospitals, maybe not in India, all over the world, patients, when they are weaned off and are being extubated, they are shifted to a better negative pressure areas, which is very unlikely at our center. So once we are weaning these patients, they should be near a place where you have, if you have made your ICUs into a negative pressure areas by putting in exhaust fans, they should be near that place. So once you extubate them and aerosol is generated, it settles down or it is removed.
There's a related question, sir, if you can take it on application of a ventilation. So this is coming from Maharashtra. How to manage patients with subcutaneous emphysema on positive pressure ventilation with COVID-19 pneumonia.
So your voice is not audible. So can you repeat the question?
The question is on how to manage patients with subcutaneous emphysema on positive pressure ventilation with COVID-19 pneumonia without obvious pneumothorax.
Okay. Am I audible, please?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. We have seen these patients in the last 4 months. I would have personally seen about 4 patients with pneumomediastinum and such kind of issues because of patients being ventilated. One of them was a doctor who finally succumbed to his diseases. You would have read in the newspapers, was shifted to us from another medical college with a lot of subcutaneous emphysema and pneumomediastinum. It is not common, but it happens. Now, what we usually do if we have it and these patients get intubated. Initially, all our 3 patients whom we had this, we tried not to intubate them and manage them without intubation, but 2 of them had to be intubated. What protocol we made was that we were having an X-ray test done every day to see whether the problem was increasing or not, take care of the clinical numbers, and then keep in mind that if ventilation is going to be a problem, you may have to put in subcutaneous drains or put intrapleural bilateral chest drains. There would be a high possibility of generating higher pressures and patients going into pneumothorax and tension pneumothorax. So in one of the patients, we had to put after postponing chest drains, we had to put it on day 3 because we were unable to maintain his saturation. So we put bilateral chest drains, and the patient showed improvement in his numbers of saturation. One must realize that the tidal volume has to be low. You could increase the rate, and you would have to prevent high plateau pressures and high peak pressures. After having said that, one of our patients landed up into a massive leak after the chest drain was put. Maybe there was an injury at the alveolar level, but it settled down in the next 4 to 5 days. So this is the way you proceed with surgical emphysema and pneumomediastinum, which is not uncommon in these group of patients.
Next question, Anand. Anand, if you can ask, this question is coming from Bihar, the Center of Excellence from Bihar, and they're asking about guidance on lung fibrosis. What are the outcomes and how do you manage?
Okay, thank you. So now, as we are into say 4 or 5 months into the active pandemic, and after discharge, when we see a couple of these patients, we are seeing more and more patients with chronic lung sequelae following the pneumonia, and because it's a viral pneumonia, acute interstitial pneumonia, just like we used to see in swine flu. As a consequence, we are also seeing similar types of fibrotic sequelae and interstitial fibrosis here as well. So, although we cannot give a number that what is the percentage of those people who will develop, but I think most of these centers, who are the larger centers, are seeing patients coming back with dyspnea and features of interstitial fibrosis when the CT scan is being done, and some restrictive lung disease as well. So guidance at this point of time, there is no clear-cut guideline as to this. So because this again is a relatively recent phenomenon that we have started seeing. And one is, of course, to supplement the saturation of the patient. They may need more oxygen. They may need long-term oxygen therapy for at home as well. They may need some support here, and they may need some evaluation for the restrictive lung disease, and maybe follow it up over a period of couple of weeks to see any progression. They may also, based on the CT scan, may need if there is any evidence of ground glass or anything in that CT scan, then they may need probably a slightly longer course of steroids as well, because usually in hospital we usually give steroids for say 7 to 10 days and then we finish it off. But this group of patients, based upon the CT, may need a slightly longer course of steroids. Thirdly would be the obvious question on the role of antifibrotics, and that again is now a question which is coming up, and there are review articles which are debating on this, whether we have only two proper antifibrotics with us, the pirfenidone and the nintedanib, and they are used for the fibrotic lung diseases. So whether they are useful or not, probably there are, we don't have evidence because it is too new, too early for that. But based upon the mechanism of action, it is possible that if they are given, for example, it was documented in one autopsy study actually from which was very recently published, that those who had symptoms in the first week, and then they autopsy was done, they died, and those vis-a-vis those who had longer duration of stay in the hospital, longer duration of hypoxia, the interstitial fibrosis was much more as the duration of the symptoms or the duration of illness progressed. That means probably if the antifibrotics is to be given relatively early enough in the disease, it might help to prevent the progression. So pirfenidone and nintedanib are the two options we have as of now. Which is better, how much they work, we really don't know. That probably we'll have to see, and then over the next couple of weeks.
Thank you, Anand. If I can ask
Hello.
next question to,
Hello.
can you hear us?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Manish, there is a question. I think you've kind of summed it up, but to just briefly again reiterate over here is what are the predictors of progression to complication in a previously healthy? What I think it means in a mild case. What are the predictors to progression to complication? And a related question is how do you manage cytokine storm?
So the first part is otherwise healthy individual risk factors for progression to severe disease. So this is what was briefly discussed. So if we take out the comorbidities, the predictors that we have remaining with us is age and gender, obviously. Besides a host of biochemical parameters that we discussed, probably most important of them being D-dimer, CRP and ferritin. So these can be followed up in these patients. If they require admission, if they are requiring oxygen, they may be done at baseline to really see if they are likely to go into severe disease, and they may be repeated if the patient is not improving maybe over next 2-3 days. So basically, if you take out the comorbidities, it remains the age. Age is probably one of the most important predictors, as we just saw in the presentation that at age above 60-70 years, the mortality rate is very high. And then we have biomarkers, there are 30 of them, but we should limit ourselves to the 2-3 most relevant, important, and readily available to us. The second one is about cytokine storm. Now, the most important thing about cytokine storm is identifying the cytokine storm. It is not easy clinically. When the patient goes from a phase of extensive viral pneumonitis, the inflammation spills over into the body and there is a state of hyperinflammation. So there is no biomarker, single biomarker, which will tell us whether this is a cytokine storm. As we saw in a case, IL-6 was more than 9 times, but still the patient was still low. So we have to use a combination of clinical factors and some biochemical parameters. So clinical factor, the most important is worsening shortness of breath, increasing requirement of respiratory support. In addition, we will be using these biomarkers that we discussed. So first thing is identifying the biomarkers. Now, once the cytokine storm sets in, we have identified the cytokine storm. The treatment modality would only be modulating the immune system. Antivirals at this point in time will have no role. So immunomodulators, these patients are already started on steroids. So probably steroid is the best immunomodulator that we should continue and bank on it to wither the cytokine storm. And anti-IL-6 antibody, tocilizumab, obviously is being used widely. There are many reports There is a question mark on what should be the level of IL-6 above which this has to be instituted. A level of around 5 to 7 times the upper limit of normal is usually used to give tocilizumab, but as again showed in my presentation, it is always has to be a combination of clinical factors and the biochemical, the IL-6 levels to decide upon this therapy. Now, recently, very recently, we had this presser release of the Covacta trial, wherein the main funder Roche has talked about the tocilizumab trial, where 450 random patients were randomized, and there was no benefits were seen. However, if we look at the trial closely, the inclusion criteria has included a PF ratio of less than 300. All patients are included. Usually, what we do is we go for such therapies only in a moderately severe patient. The PF ratios are usually quite less, maybe less than 150, so there are no definite cutoffs. So we still have to see the data. The data is yet not published. Once the data is out, we will need to see whether there is any subset of patients which may benefit from such immunomodulator therapy. So currently, so this is a position that we are in here. Steroids will remain the mainstay of therapy for this cytokine storm, and maybe tocilizumab or IL-6 inhibitor in some subset of patients with some characteristics which we are yet not clear about.
Next question is been asked from Rajasthan, and there's a related question from Tamil Nadu on guidance for cardiovascular complications and how do you manage incidence of acute coronary events in COVID positive patients. So I can take that question and Sir can add. So as far as cardiovascular complications are concerned, there was some early literature and there was a lot of concern on increased cardiovascular complication in these patients. But from what we've seen in our experience in the last 3-4 months and what is coming out also, there is a role of anticoagulation definitely in this disease, and it's a part of the national guidelines. Anybody with moderate disease should definitely be on prophylactic heparin. Usually recommend enoxaparin is to be avoided and heparin is recommended. So if you have to give full therapeutic dose, 5,000 subcutaneous BD in people less than 50 kgs of weight. And if the weight is more than 50 kgs, 7,500 subcutaneous thrice a day is what is recommended. There are other questions I can see on the chat box about the role of NOACs and dabigatran. So I don't think there is data to recommend that currently. In all hospitalized patients, it's better to continue with heparin or enoxaparin, which is clearly preferred. Some people have tried, and there's a related question on post-discharge use of anticoagulation. This was discussed yesterday also in the grand rounds here. I don't think there is any reason to give prolonged anticoagulation unless the patient has a preceding reason for giving anticoagulation. So COVID-19 itself does not make a case for giving prolonged anticoagulation. Yes, if you have other conditions like you have atrial fibrillation, you have DVT, you have developed DVT during the course of your ICU stay, and or are other high-risk markers for future VTE, venous thrombus embolism. Yes, then in those cases we can give you, you can be given prolonged anticoagulation, which can be in form of the newer DOACs, the direct oral anticoagulants. That's what the protocol we've been following, and so some questions are coming in the chat box. You can, if you have some more questions, you can definitely keep adding that. Or the one question I can see is steroids other than dexamethasone that can be given. Manish, you want to answer that?
Yes, although the data is with dexamethasone, methylprednisolone and prednisolone can very well be given. We just need to take care of the dose. So 6 mg equivalent would be methylprednisolone of 30 mg or prednisolone of 40 mg. So we just need to take care of the dose. It can be given as in the national guidelines.
Anand, can you take that question on pulmonary radiation? Any role in pulmonary?
role of pulmonary radiation actually came about that, in fact, there's a trial going on over here as well, in which they're giving a very low dose of radiotherapy in patients with pneumonia. There is a mild to moderate type of pneumonia. And we don't have the exact full details of the entire, it is still ongoing, but in some patient, definitely there was some role and there was some benefit by giving this in moderate illness, very, very low dose of radiotherapy. So this has not been tried in a randomized fashion, but there are reports even earlier that radiotherapy, ultra low dose radiotherapy in pneumonias has been shown to have slow down the progression of the disease. So probably in the next couple of weeks, we might be able to give you a more clear answer to this question.
I think there's one clinical question, clinical scenario which been put up. It's a healthcare worker has mild COVID 4 weeks back, 23-year-old male, now 3 days progressive respiratory symptoms and recurrent swabs which are negative. High biomarkers, CRP, D-dimer, lymphopenia, HRCT done 2 days back is normal. Now, I guess it's written as worsening X-ray and hypoxemia, maintaining only on NRBM. Is on antibiotic, low molecular weight heparin, therapeutic dose of low molecular weight heparin. What are the treatment options? Plasma and or anti-IL-6. Can we give tocilizumab in the absence of RT-PCR being positive? So I think this is a difficult one. Anand, can you take that, and maybe Manish, you could.
What I gather from here is if the HRCT is normal, then so that means that there is no pneumonia per se. Is that what? Because hypoxemia is there. So is there some other cause of the hypoxemia? Is it that he is in pulmonary thromboembolic state? Because that might have to be seen. You said the D dimer is high, so that has to be ruled out. A delayed phase. He had mild COVID 4 weeks back, so there is no reason for COVID to be there for 4 weeks. There may be a delayed complication, and to my mind, one delayed complication may be the pulmonary thromboembolic phenomenon. So that probably has to be ruled out.
CT pulmonary angio should be
Yeah.
added to the HRCT.
Maybe a CT pulmonary angio at this point of time may be done, if possible. Yeah. And maybe you can step up the low molecular weight heparin, like you said, the therapeutic dose I think is fine, but quickly get a CTP and then we'll see.
I think the question is on role of convalescent plasma. I think it was again discussed extensively yesterday. Yeah, so I think most of you have attended it, so it's been discussed. And then the next question.
How many doses of tocilizumab, keeping in mind super infection?
Yeah. So how many doses of TCZ to be given? Most of the time we have given one, and if needed be, you repeat one. So that's not more than two. After 48, yeah, 36 to 48 hours, depending on the response. And if the patient not improving, you can give the second dose of it. But of course, you have to be mindful of the fact there is chance of added infection every time you give it. Obesity and patients on dialysis having higher mortality. I think that's right.
Yes, obesity is a risk factor, and the mortality is higher in patients who have high BMI. Regarding patient on dialysis, CKD patients as such can present with a COVID infection, which is totally unrelated because they have been to hospital settings or dialysis centers. We also have a larger number of patients who get sick, who need high flow oxygens, and they land up into AKI, which is related to this ICU stay for that matter, or sepsis which they develop following the viral infection. And, there is higher mortality rate in this group subgroup also. So if you have a patient who is obese, has developed AKI or has CKD on dialysis, yes, they have a high mortality rate.
I think we've covered most of the questions. If there is anything else, we can take a question from one of the participants, or we could wind up. I can go to the ministry to moderate further.
So I think if there are no questions, uh, we would like to, on the ministry side, thank all the participants and all the mentors from the All India Institute, Professor Alpha, Professor Anand Mohan, Roy, Nish, very of course. So, and I think the team has very precisely and concisely given all the answers and a lot of good take-home messages. So I think we have benefit to all the centers of excellence. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.